Hello world civilizations, Mr. Lassiter here with you again. And today we're going to be talking about Mesopotamia. In class today we mapped where this region was, as well as some of the other ancient civilizations that we're going to study, and we talked about them a little bit. And we're going to begin with our first of our cradles of civilization. Mesopotamia was located in what is present-day Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. By the end of this video, you should be able to do the following things. Describe the location and important geographic features of Mesopotamia, to explain the class structure of Mesopotamian societies, describe the religion and culture of Mesopotamia, as well as define or identify in your digital notebook the following terms: Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Zigurats, polytheistic, cuneiform, and Hammurabi. So let's get started with Mesopotamia. The name for this region actually came about from a Greek word, which meant the land between the waters, or sometimes translated as between two rivers. And those rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates. It is part of a region of the world known as the Fertile Crescent, which encouraged farming because of the fertile soil in that area of the world. Water had to be controlled through irrigation, though, as you can see in the picture here, through the use of canals and dams, etc. Flooding brought good soil to the region in lieu of rain, but it could be very unpredictable and even dangerous if it wasn't controlled properly. And that led to some troubles farming in Mesopotamia, but ultimately the good soil allowed cities to develop there. This map shows Mesopotamia in the Fertile Crescent region, with the Tigris River and the Euphrates River running right through the area. And as you can see, these labeled cities are the city-states that developed in the region. You had the Assyrian kingdom in the north, the Babylonian kingdom kind of midway, and Sumer, or Sumerians, in the southern part of Mesopotamia. And they ruled at different times. This is the region today. Again, we see the Tigris River and the Euphrates River, so mostly in what is now present-day, Iraq and Syria. So let's talk about geography. Farming came to the region in about 6000 BC. The first cities begin to emerge in about 3200 BC. As we've talked about, if you don't need to move around to find your food, you can settle down. And people would settle into communities, which developed into villages, and eventually a bunch of villages would get together and you would have a city. And these cities were centers for trade. Traders used the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, as well as their tributaries, to ship goods and trade with other cities and other civilizations even. And these traders went out further and further. We have records of them trading with people in India even. Let's talk a little bit about the government. Most of these regions were governed by city-states. So it was basically a self-governing city with a king, which consisted of the kingdom consisting of the city and the villages and farmland around the city. While priests and priestesses were originally at the top of the social structure, the development of kings to protect these city-states became more important, and eventually kings took on religious roles as well as governmental roles. And they were at the top of the strict social structure of Mesopotamian society, especially Sumerian society. So at the top you had kings and priestesses for the religious purposes, followed by a noble class of warriors and judges. These would have been kind of the people who carried out judgment, but also the ones who fought in battle and defended the city-states. Followed by free commoners. These were your farmers, builders, craftsmen, professionals, scribes, the people who wrote. Followed by dependent clients, people who owned no property but worked. And lastly, slaves, who oftentimes were either captured in battle or owed some type of debt so that they had no property and had to work it off. Sumerians were primarily polytheistic, meaning they believed in many gods. Religion was very important in ancient Sumer and throughout all of Mesopotamia. Polytheism, or the belief in many gods, is opposed to monotheism, monotheism, which means the belief in one God. Temples were at the center of Mesopotamian cities, and we have examples of these with ziggurats, which were huge pyramid-like temples for religious worship and ceremonies. Sumerians did believe in an afterlife, although not necessarily a happy one. They saw it as kind of dark and gloomy. Here's an image of these ziggurats. On the left, you see one as it appears today. It would have been sort of like a step pyramid with steps leading to the top. And on the right, a drawing of what one may have looked like originally. Again, these were the centers for worship in these Sumerian communities. Education was very important in ancient Sumer, in Mesopotamia. They invented the earliest form of writing, and that's called cuneiform. It developed from a need to keep track of food and goods. Originally, they did so with tokens, and then they put symbols on the tokens, and they realized that they could use those symbols to represent words and sounds even. They were more like pictures that represented, or that were used for writing. And I'll show you a picture of this in the next slide. Sumerians also made advances in math. For example, they developed the idea to divide the day into 24 hours with 60 minutes and 60 seconds in a minute. They also made advances in algebra and geometry, as evidenced by their building. The Epic of Gilgamesh was one of the most important early epic poems. Excuse me for the typo there. It was a story of a wild king, Gilgamesh, who spurns the gods and makes the gods angry. And so they kill his friend, and so he goes on search for eternal life, so he does not meet the same doom. Here's some examples of cuneiform writing, and you can see on the left how it changed over time. You had outline characters around 3500 BC when it develops. 1,000 years later, keep in mind, 1,000 years, the English that we use has not been spoken for 1,000 years. You have another form of it, kind of very similar to the original, and by the time the Assyrians take over in the year 700, you have an even more developed form, and of course late Babylonian period, almost unrecognizable. Now we think of cuneiform a lot because it was used to write the first law code, or one of the earliest law codes ever written, by Hammurabi, who was one of the most famous emperors in Mesopotamia, primarily because of this law code. He ruled over Babylon, and they carved his laws in stone columns. And here you see an example of one, which is in a museum in Paris. There were three main principles for these laws, which we read some of them at the beginning of the year. First of all, retribution, an eye for an eye. If you do something to somebody, you get the same thing for punishment. Also, you saw harsher punishments for lower classes, especially as you got down to the lowest classes. Those punishments were usually resulting in death. But lastly, these laws decided that the government had a responsibility to the people it protected. So, for example, if a thief was not found when you had something stolen from your house, and you had witnesses to say that this thing has gone missing, the government would reimburse you for that. Of course, if you were caught lying and you were not high enough up in the social structure, you could imagine that you were going to die. So let's review what we should have been able to do. Describe the location and important geographic features of Mesopotamia. Check. Explain the social class structure. Check. Describe the religion and culture. Check. And then you need to define these terms in your notebook. Tomorrow we will come in and we will work a little bit more on this activity. Also tonight you need to read and answer the questions that go along with this video and your reading. Have a wonderful evening.